My parents had one unbreakable rule: no strangers in our house, ever. Then I started choking on candy while home alone and let my friend inside to save my life. What happened when you broke your parents' #1 rule? My parents had one unbreakable rule that they treated like federal law. Absolutely no one could ever enter our house unless they were blood relatives or certified professionals with insurance paperwork. They'd been robbed once before I was born, and after that, they decided every non-family member was a potential thief or murderer waiting for access to our home. They installed 9 security cameras, 3 deadbolts on every door, and a system that sent alerts to their phones if anyone even stepped on our porch. When delivery drivers came, we had to meet them at the street because they couldn't touch our property. My parents would literally rather die than have a stranger in the house, and they said this constantly like it was something to be proud of. And so I was the kid who could never reciprocate anything. Friends would invite me over constantly, but I could never return the favor, so eventually they stopped asking and assumed I was ashamed of my house or secretly hated them. Group projects were a nightmare because we always had to meet at the library, even during blizzards when everyone else's parents were begging to host. My girlfriend of 6 months dumped me because she thought I was hiding something, when really my parents just threatened to change the locks if I ever brought her inside. Birthday parties, study groups, even just watching movies like normal teenagers did was completely impossible at my house. When my best friend's mom died, everyone in our friend group hosted him for dinners to help out except me. My parents said grief wasn't an exception to the rule. He never really forgave me for that, even though I tried to explain. Senior year, my parents started leaving me alone more often because they finally trusted I wouldn't break their sacred rule after 17 years of perfect obedience. They'd go to their marriage counseling every Thursday afternoon, which honestly they needed because their paranoia was destroying their relationship too. Those 2 hours became my only time to feel normal in my own house. I'd eat snacks in the living room instead of the kitchen, watch TV without headphones, and pretend other humans were allowed to exist in our space. My friend Leo knew about these Thursday windows, and always joked that he should come over just to see what the forbidden house looked like inside. We both knew I'd never risk it though, because my parents had made it clear that breaking this rule meant losing everything. My college fund, my car, my phone, all of it would be gone. Last Thursday started normally, with my parents leaving at exactly 3 o'clock for counseling after checking all the cameras and reminding me they'd know if anyone came over. 20 minutes later, Leo showed up at my door with a bag of candy from the Korean market that we'd been talking about trying for weeks. I knew I should send him away, but I was so tired of being the friend who couldn't do anything normal, and my parents wouldn't be back for over an hour. I let him in, telling myself it would just be for 5 minutes. We sat in the kitchen eating these chewy candies that were harder than we expected, and I kept checking the clock, paranoid that my parents would somehow know. Leo was doing impressions of our chemistry teacher, making me laugh so hard I forgot to be careful, and suddenly one of those candies shot straight back into my throat. I couldn't breathe or cough or even make noise. I stood up panicking, pointing at my throat, and Leo just stared at me for a second before realizing what was happening. He jumped up and started doing the Heimlich maneuver he'd learned when his mom made him take a babysitting course. It took 4 tries before the candy flew out, and I could finally breathe, collapsing on the floor, gasping while Leo kept asking if I was okay. The irony wasn't lost on either of us that breaking the rule had almost killed me, but breaking the rule had also saved me. I knew I could have just as easily choked on something Leo hadn't brought into the house, but I also knew my parents would not see it that way. He stayed for 30 minutes, making sure I could breathe normally, getting me water, checking my throat was clear, both of us knowing my parents would lose their minds if they found out. Leo had just left, and I was hiding the Korean candy bag in the outdoor trash when my phone started buzzing frantically with texts from my mom. The first text just said, "Explain," in all caps, followed by a screenshot from our security app showing Leo's face clearly as he pushed through our front door. Another showed him with his arms around me from behind, which looked like an embrace if you didn't know it was the Heimlich. Another showed him rubbing my back as I drank water on the couch, looking intimate and comfortable in the forbidden space. My phone rang immediately, and I could see it was my mom, but I couldn't make my hand answer it. I genuinely didn't know if she'd care that I'd almost died, or if she'd just focus on the rule being broken. The phone kept ringing, and then I heard something worse. Car tires squealing into our driveway. My parents were home, and I was about to wish that the candy had killed me after all. The front door slammed open so hard it bounced off the wall and left a dent in the drywall. Mom reached me first while I was still standing frozen by the trash cans with the candy wrapper in my hand. Her fingers wrapped around my wrist and yanked me toward the house while Dad stood in the doorway blocking any escape route. The muscle in his jaw kept twitching, and his hands were balled into fists at his sides. Mom's eyes looked wild and unfocused as she pulled me through the door and into the foyer. She started firing questions at me without waiting for answers, while Dad moved behind me to block the door completely. My mouth opened to explain about the choking, but nothing came out except a weird croaking sound. The words literally stuck in my throat, which felt like the universe's idea of a sick joke. Mom kept asking the same questions over and over while shaking my shoulders hard enough to make my teeth rattle. I finally managed to lift my shirt up to show them the red marks on my stomach from where Leo had pressed during the Heimlich. The skin was already turning purple in spots, and you could see the exact outline of his hand. hands. I pointed at my throat, which was still raw and swollen from the candy getting lodged there, but they weren't looking at the evidence that I'd almost died. Mom had her phone out showing me the screenshots from the security cameras again and again. She kept pointing at the one where Leo's arms were wrapped around me from behind. Dad grabbed the phone and zoomed in on Leo's face pressed against my back. They kept using words like intimate and inappropriate, while completely ignoring the bruises on my stomach. Dad suddenly reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone before I could react. He grabbed my car keys from the hook by the door and shoved both into his pocket. Mom started listing everything else they were taking away while Dad said my college fund was gone. He pulled out his phone right there and started logging into the bank app to show me he meant it. The account balance appeared on the screen and he moved his finger toward the transfer button. Mom grabbed his wrist and said they should think about this first before doing something permanent. That started a whole new fight between them about whose fault this was. Mom blamed Dad for not installing cameras in more rooms to catch things earlier. Dad blamed Mom for convincing him to leave me alone during their counseling sessions. They stood there screaming at each other while I pressed myself against the wall trying to become invisible. Mom said Dad's paranoia wasn't strong enough if someone got into their house. Dad said Mom's trust in me was the real problem since I'd obviously been planning this. I realized their perfect united front about the rules had cracks I'd never seen before. This information might be useful later if I survived the next few hours. Dad finally stopped arguing with Mom and pulled out his tablet to review the security footage properly. We sat in the living room for the next hour watching every second of Leo's visit on the screen. Dad narrated each moment like he was presenting evidence to a jury. He paused on Leo walking through the door and zoomed in on his face. He replayed the part where we sat eating candy at least 10 times. When the footage showed me choking, he fast-forwarded through it like it didn't matter. He slowed down again when Leo's arms went around me for the Heimlich maneuver. Mom kept switching between asking how I could betray them and wondering what else Leo might have done. She never once acknowledged that Leo had saved my life, even though the footage clearly showed me choking. Dad made me watch the part where Leo rubbed my back while I drank water on the couch. He kept saying it looked too comfortable and familiar for a first visit to the house. The footage ended with Leo leaving and me taking the candy bag to the trash. Before sending me to bed, they announced a whole new set of rules starting immediately. No eating anywhere in the house except at the kitchen table, even when I was alone. Every snack had to be pre-approved by them with a photo sent for verification. When they left the house, I had to text them photos every 30 minutes showing where I was. The house that already felt like a prison somehow got even smaller and more suffocating. They followed me to my room and watched while I got ready for bed like I might try to escape. Later that night, I opened my laptop to message Leo and let him know I was okay. I wanted to thank him properly for saving my life since I hadn't gotten the chance earlier. The browser wouldn't load, and I realized the Wi-Fi had been disconnected from my devices. Dad appeared in my doorway holding the router and said, "Internet was a privilege I hadn't earned back." I'm trying to understand why the parents completely ignored the bruises showing their son almost died. The way they fast-forwarded through the choking part, but replayed Leo just sitting there eating candy makes me wonder what their fear really comes from. He stood there for a minute watching me before closing my door, and I heard him testing the lock. I lay in bed replaying the choking moment over and over in my head all night. I could still feel the candy lodged in my throat and the panic of not being able to breathe. Leo's arms around me had been the only thing between me and dying alone in that kitchen. Part of me felt grateful to be alive, but another part wondered if things would be simpler if he hadn't been there. At least then my parents couldn't punish me for breaking their most important rule. The next morning at the school, Leo found me at my locker before first period started. He kept his voice low like we were planning something illegal when he asked if I was okay. I told him my parents had seen everything on the cameras, and his face went pale. He winced when I explained about losing my phone and internet access and probably my college fund. But I finally got to say thank you for saving my life, which was all I'd wanted to do since yesterday. Leo grabbed my arm before I could walk away and said we should go to my parents together after school to explain everything. I pulled away and told him that was the worst possible idea because they'd probably try to sue him or call the cops or get a restraining order against him. He looked hurt, but I knew my parents better than anyone, and adding more fuel to their paranoia fire would only make things worse for both of us. The warning bell rang and we went to our separate classes, but I couldn't focus on anything the teacher was saying. During my free period, I found myself walking toward the counselor's office without really planning it. The new counselor this year was Fiona Walsh, who didn't know my family's reputation yet, which made her perfect. I knocked on her door, and she waved me in with this warm smile that made me want to tell her everything. I sat down and started talking about the cameras and the rules and what happened yesterday with the choking and Leo saving me. She listened without interrupting or making any faces that showed she thought my parents were crazy. When I finished, she asked how long things had been like this, and I told her since before I could remember, but it got worse every year. She suggested we could work on a gradual plan to help my parents see how their rules were affecting me and maybe get them to loosen up a little. I immediately said no parent contact because that would destroy any trust I had left with them. She nodded and said we could start by just documenting things and meeting weekly to talk through strategies. I agreed and felt slightly better having someone who knew what was really going on. When I got home that afternoon, there was a white van in our driveway, and a guy guy installing a new camera in the hallway right outside my bedroom door. He mentioned my dad had ordered 3 more cameras for the blind spots around the house and pointed to boxes on the kitchen counter. I looked at the boxes and saw they were motion sensors and some kind of smart lock system that probably cost more than most people's rent. My mom was in the kitchen making dinner and didn't even look at me when I walked in. At dinner, I tried one more time to find middle ground by suggesting I could take a first aid course, so I'd be prepared if something like the choking happened again when I was alone. My dad put down his fork and said the solution was much simpler than that. Just never break the rule again, he said, while my mom stared at her plate like it was the most interesting thing in the world. I wanted to scream that I could have died, but I knew it wouldn't matter to them. The next day in chemistry class, Julius Keller pulled me aside before the bell rang and told me my parents had emailed him. They said I couldn't participate in group lab work anymore unless he personally supervised every interaction. The whole class heard him say it, and I felt my face burn as everyone stared at me. My lab partner asked if I was in witness protection or something, and people laughed, but not in a nice way. I sat through the rest of class wanting to disappear into the floor while everyone whispered about what kind of freaks parents email teachers about lab partners. After school, I went to the library to use the computers since I didn't have internet at home anymore. I still had my laptop for typing papers, but needed Wi-Fi to submit assignments and check things. I logged into my bank app to see if my college fund was really gone, and my stomach dropped. The account was still there, but it had been changed to require 2 signatures for any withdrawal. My parents had literally locked me out of my own future money that I'd been saving since I was 5. I sat there staring at the screen, realizing they'd actually follow through on every threat they made. I needed to start making my own money immediately if I ever wanted to escape after graduation. The coffee shop near school had a help wanted sign, and I walked in to apply without telling my parents. The shift lead was a college girl named Georgia Reeves, who seemed cool and didn't ask too many questions about why I could only work certain hours. She hired me on the spot for afternoons and weekends, which meant I'd be out of the house more. I figured I could tell my parents I joined a study group or something. That lie lasted exactly 2 days before my parents confronted me at dinner with printouts from the coffee shop's Facebook page that showed me in the background wearing an apron. They probably tracked my car or had some app on my laptop I didn't know about. I braced for them to forbid the job, but surprisingly, they said I could keep it with conditions. All my paychecks had to be deposited directly into their account, and they would give me an allowance from my own earnings. It was humiliating, but at least I was out of the house more hours every week. What they didn't know was that cash tips went straight into my pocket, and after 2 weeks, I had enough saved to buy a prepaid phone at the gas station. I kept it hidden in my school locker behind my textbooks, and only turned it on during lunch or after school. It was a tiny lifeline to the outside world that they didn't control, and I felt like a spy in my own life, having this one secret thing. 3 days later, I was dragging the trash bins to the curb when Warren from next door waved me over from his driveway. He was this old guy who'd lived here forever, and he started talking about how he remembered when my parents first moved in, right after their big break-in. I kept nodding politely while he rambled about property values until he mentioned something that made me freeze. He said those kids who broke in back then were just high schoolers from 2 streets over who took $20 from the counter and an old toaster as a prank. The cops caught them that same night, and they had to do community service. This whole time, my parents had been acting like violent criminals had invaded our home, when it was basically just stupid teenagers being idiots. I wanted to ask more questions, but Mom appeared at our front door glaring at me for talking to a neighbor too long. The next week at my second session with Fiona, she asked me to describe a typical day at home, and I told her about the cameras, the locks, the rules about no visitors. She took notes while I talked, and when I finished, she set down her pen and explained that what my parents were doing sounded like trauma that had turned into something else. She said the word control about 6 times and kept using phrases like unhealthy patterns and isolation tactics, which made my stomach twist because hearing someone else say it wasn't normal made it real. That evening, I sat at my desk and wrote my parents a 3-page letter explaining everything. How scared I was while choking, how Leo saved my life, how lonely I'd been for years, how their rules were making me lose friends and opportunities. I left it on the kitchen table before school the next morning. When I got home, there was a typed document waiting for me titled Home Safety and Security Contract with 37 numbered rules, including wearing a GPS tracker at all times, submitting to random bag searches, and installing tracking software on all my devices. There wasn't a single word about my letter or the choking or anything I'd written about being lonely. I crossed out the GPS tracker line and the bag search line with black marker and left it on the counter unsigned. Dad found it an hour later and told me if I didn't sign the whole thing exactly as written, I could forget about prom, graduation parties, or any senior events because I'd be grounded until college. I signed it anyway, but kept the crossed out parts crossed out, which made him slam his fist on the table so hard the salt shaker fell over. At lunch the next day, Leo found me in the library looking exhausted and asked straight out if he'd made my life worse by coming over that day. I wanted to lie, but we both knew things had gotten harder, and I could see him carrying guilt about it even though he'd literally saved my life. I told him it wasn't his fault, but he kept apologizing anyway. That weekend, I signed up for a CPR certification course at the community center, taught by some guy named Wade on Saturday mornings. My parents couldn't argue with me learning emergency safety skills, and it gave me another excuse to leave the house. The course took 3 weeks, and when I showed my parents the certificate, Mom's face softened for just a second before she caught herself and went back to stone. Dad just grunted that this didn't change any rules, but I noticed Mom didn't immediately agree with him like usual. I picked up extra shifts at the cafe whenever my parents were at counseling or running errands, sometimes working until my hands shook from exhaustion. My homework started slipping because I was squeezing in hours whenever possible, and Georgia pulled me aside to ask if everything was okay at home. The parents found out about her secret job through Facebook photos after just 2 days. That's some serious detective work for people who claim they're just worried about safety. Makes me wonder if they spend all day searching for ways to catch her breaking rules. She offered to adjust my schedule, but I needed every dollar for my escape fund, so I told her I was fine. The next Monday, I nearly fell asleep standing up during Julius's lecture, and he kept me after class. He said he understood difficult home situations and offered me an extension on my lab report, which made my throat tight because that small kindness felt huge after weeks of my parents treating me like a criminal. I took the extension and used the extra time to work another shift instead of catching up on sleep. My grades were dropping, but my savings were growing, and I kept telling myself it would be worth it when I finally got out. The prepaid phone became my lifeline to sanity, letting me text Leo and a few other friends during lunch without my parents tracking every conversation. I started looking at apartment listings in other states, calculating how many months of rent I could cover with my cafe money. Some nights I'd lie awake doing math in my head, figuring out exactly how many more shifts I needed to survive on my own. My parents noticed I was tired all the time, but assumed it was from studying, which was ironic since I was barely keeping up with assignments anymore. They added a new rule about mandatory study hours from 7 to 9 every night, where I had to sit at the kitchen table where they could watch me, but I just used that time to plan my escape in a notebook that looked like chemistry notes. The next morning, I came downstairs to find Dad installing a padlock on the pantry door while Mom watched from the kitchen table. He showed me the key on his keychain and said I'd need to ask before getting any food for my own safety and portion control. The fridge got the same treatment an hour later. I had to stand there and watch him drill holes in our kitchen cabinets like we lived in some kind of prison. When I asked for a granola bar at lunch, he made me wait 10 minutes while he finished a phone call, then watched me eat it at the table. The anger burned so quiet and steady in my chest that I thought it might actually catch fire. 3 days of asking permission to eat crackers or grab an apple made me feel less than human. Fiona called the house phone that Thursday and asked to speak with my parents about scheduling a support meeting. She framed it as helping them keep me safe, which was smart because Dad actually agreed to it. Mom seemed relieved someone else wanted to talk about the situation. They scheduled it for the following Tuesday afternoon. I sat at the top of the stairs during the call, listening through the heating vent. Fiona's voice came through the speakerphone calm and professional as she asked about their safety concerns. Mom started crying halfway through, talking about nightmares where strangers broke in and hurt me, how the cameras helped her sleep at night. Dad cut her off to explain it was about respect and following rules, that I needed to learn consequences. They weren't even telling the same story. Fiona suggested family counseling sessions at the school where everyone could work together. Dad's voice got sharp immediately, saying they already had counseling and didn't need interference from the school. Mom stayed quiet, but I could picture her face, the way she looked when she was thinking about disagreeing with him. The call ended with nothing resolved. Warren showed up at the school the next day with a folded newspaper clipping from 15 years ago. He'd gone to the library and looked up the break-in my parents always talked about. The article was tiny, buried on page 6. 2 teenagers had broken a basement window and stolen a DVD player and some cash from a jar. No weapons, no violence, nobody was even home. The kids got caught the same day and returned everything. My parents had built their entire life around something that barely made the local news. I kept the article in my backpack for 2 days before showing Mom while Dad was at work. She read it 3 times, then admitted she knew it hadn't been that bad. But she kept saying it could have been worse. What if I'd been home? What if they'd had knives? When Dad walked in and saw us with the article, his face went red. He accused me of trying to turn Mom against him and stormed out to the garage. The house felt like a bomb waiting to go off for the next 3 days. Dad stopped talking to me completely, only communicating through Mom. He started driving me to the school himself instead of letting me take my car. During my shift at the cafe, I'd look out and see his truck in the parking lot, just sitting there watching. My curfew moved to 8 p.m. even on Saturdays. When I tried to leave for work through the back door while he was in the bathroom, the new motion sensor he'd installed sent an alert to his phone. He came running out with his phone in his hand, yelling about trust and respect. He said if I ever tried sneaking out again, he'd report me as a runaway and let the police deal with me. The desperation in his voice scared me more than the threat. I started keeping my burner phone in my locker at work and called Fiona from the cafe bathroom during my break. She helped me create a safety plan over the next few calls. We listed emergency contacts, documented everything that was happening, took photos of the locks on the food. She kept saying this was about being prepared, not planning to run away, but we both knew where this was heading. She gave me the number for a youth shelter and made me memorize it. Leo started meeting me at the library during lunch instead of the cafeteria. We'd sit in the back corner where nobody went, eating sandwiches he brought from home since I couldn't access food at my house without permission. He never brought up that Thursday when he saved my life, but he always checked if I was eating enough, sleeping okay, day, keeping it together. The library became the only place that felt safe. My grades started dropping because I couldn't focus on anything except counting days until graduation. Teachers noticed, but I couldn't explain that my parents had locked up the food and tracked my every movement. Fiona tried calling the house again, but Dad wouldn't take her calls. Mom answered once when he was outside and whispered that she was trying to talk to him, then hung up when she heard the garage door. Every day felt like walking on glass, waiting for something to shatter. Prom tickets went on sale the next Monday, and everyone rushed to get them during lunch. The form needed a parent's signature and a $50 deposit. I brought it home that night, and Dad looked at it for exactly 2 seconds before tossing it in the trash. Mom picked it up and smoothed it out, saying she'd think about it, but we all knew what that meant. I watched my friends at the school planning their outfits and dinner reservations, while I pretended I thought prom was stupid anyway. Fiona called the school after hearing about the situation from somewhere, probably Mom's whispered phone calls when Dad was in the shower. She met with the principal and worked out this weird arrangement where I could go with a teacher checking on me every hour instead of needing parent permission. The principal called it a special accommodation for my unique family situation, which was embarrassing, but better than missing prom completely. Dad found out when the school sent a confirmation letter home, and he went ballistic. He called the principal screaming about undermining parental authority and threatened to sue the school district. That night, he brought his toolbox upstairs and removed my bedroom door from its hinges. He carried it down to the basement while telling me that privacy was something you earned through trust, not something you deserved automatically. I hung a sheet across the doorway with thumbtacks, so I could at least change clothes without him watching from the hallway. The message was clear, though. I didn't have any space that belonged to just me anymore. I started keeping important stuff at the school after that. I found an old gym bag in the lost, and found and slowly filled it with clothes, my birth certificate I'd grabbed from the filing cabinet, and some cash I'd been saving. Warren saw me stuffing it into my locker one morning and offered his couch if things got worse. We both hoped I wouldn't need it, but having an escape plan made me breathe easier. Mom went through my backpack while I was in the shower, claiming she was looking for dirty gym clothes to wash. She found the burner phone Warren had given me hidden in the inside pocket. When I came downstairs, she was holding it, and Dad was already yelling about deception and betrayal. I didn't even try to lie about it. I told them straight up that I needed one way to talk to people without them reading every single message. Dad grabbed the phone and smashed it against the kitchen counter until pieces of plastic scattered across the floor. The next morning, he called the cafe while I was working the breakfast shift. I could hear him through the phone from across the room, demanding that Georgia fire me immediately for being untrustworthy and disrespectful to my family. Georgia listened to him rant for 5 minutes, then calmly told him that unless I did something wrong at work, she wasn't letting me go. She did cut my hours from 20 to 12 per week to avoid more drama, which hurt my savings but showed she was trying to protect me. I spent my lunch periods in the computer lab after that, filling out every college application I could find. Early admission programs, summer bridge courses, work-study opportunities, anything that would get me out of the house before regular fall semester. The guidance counselor helped me apply for financial aid and private loans my parents couldn't control. I calculated that if I could leave in June instead of August, I'd only have to survive 2 more months at home. Mom returned my regular phone a week later with so many tracking apps installed that it barely had memory left for anything else. How did Julius know, just by looking at her, that she needed help with her home situation? The way he offered that extension without asking questions makes me wonder if teachers have special training for spotting students in trouble, or if he just has really good instincts about people. She called it a compromise and said I should be grateful she talked Dad out of keeping it permanently. Dad was furious about her giving in, and they fought about it for 3 days straight. Their united front was cracking more each day, but I was too tired to feel happy about it. The school had this mandatory family night thing where parents came to hear about senior year activities and graduation plans. Dad refused to go, saying the school had lost his respect when they undermined his authority about prom. Mom went alone and actually sat through the whole presentation. She listened to other parents talk about trusting their kids and preparing them for independence. She even took notes during the part about healthy boundaries, though she kept insisting their situation was different because of the break-in. Leo texted me on the burner phone Warren had replaced, asking if we could talk in person. We met at the park during one of my reduced shifts at the cafe. He said he understood why things were complicated and promised to respect whatever boundaries kept us both safe while I was stuck at home. We agreed to keep our distance at the school but stay in touch through Warren's phone. He promised he'd be there when I finally got out, whenever that was. We both knew our friendship would never be exactly the same, but at least it wasn't completely dead. 3 days later, Dad came home with a business card from a security company that specialized in panic rooms and advanced surveillance systems. He spread out glossy brochures on the kitchen table, showing steel-reinforced doors and military-grade cameras, while Mom nodded along like this was normal. The contractor showed up the next morning in a van covered with logos about keeping families safe from intruders. Dad walked him through every room, pointing out weak spots and asking about motion sensors for the backyard. They spent 2 hours discussing bulletproof glass for the windows and whether the panic room should go in the basement or the master bedroom. The guy kept using words like investment and peace of mind while typing numbers into his tablet. When he finally showed Dad the estimate, I saw the number $32,000 written at the bottom. bottom. Dad didn't even flinch, just asked how soon they could start and whether payment plans were available. That's when he mentioned something about moving funds around, and I felt my stomach drop. The next morning, I logged into my college savings account while my parents were at work. The balance showed $1,200 when it should have been over $30,000. My hands started shaking as I scrolled through the transaction history and saw the withdrawal dated 2 days ago. The description just said, "Transfer to checking," with no other explanation. I printed out the statement and sat there staring at the numbers like they might change if I looked long enough. Mom came home early and found me with the papers spread across my bed. She said they'd planned to tell me, but the security upgrades were urgent and college was still months away. She promised they'd replace the money before tuition was due, but I knew that was impossible. Dad got home and doubled down, saying safety was more important than anything, and I'd understand when I had kids. The grief hit me harder than the anger, because now I knew exactly where I stood in their priorities. Georgia found me crying in the cafe storage room during my next shift and made me tell her everything. She immediately pulled up scholarship websites on her phone and started making a list of deadlines. We spent every slow period at work filling out applications with her helping me write essays about overcoming adversity. I started bringing my laptop to the cafe and working on financial aid forms between customers. Sleep became something I did in 3-hour chunks between application deadlines and homework. My grades started slipping, but I couldn't care less about calculus when my entire future was falling apart. Georgia brought me energy drinks and proofread my essays while I ran on pure determination and caffeine. 2 months of this, and I'd applied to 47 scholarships ranging from $500 to $10,000. Prom arrived with the conditions we'd negotiated after weeks of arguments. Dad would sit in the school parking lot the entire time with his phone tracking my location. Mrs. Walsh had to check on me every hour and text him photos as proof I was still there. I wore the cheapest dress I could find at the thrift store, and Georgia did my makeup in the cafe bathroom. Walking into the gym felt like entering a normal teenage experience for exactly 58 minutes at a time. Between check-ins, I actually danced with some kids from my English class who didn't know about my family situation. The DJ played songs I recognized, and for brief moments I forgot about the tracking app on my phone. Mrs. Walsh would appear like clockwork, take the required photo, and disappear again, trying not to make it obvious. Dad texted me 12 times asking if I needed to leave early, but I stayed until exactly 11 when we'd agreed. The after parties were happening at 3 different houses, and Georgia begged me to sneak out to at least one. I knew Dad would be parked outside our house all night watching the security cameras to make sure I stayed put. The fight wasn't worth it anymore when I needed to save my energy for bigger battles ahead. An email arrived 3 weeks before graduation while I was at work. The subject line said partial award notification from the State University Summer Bridge program. My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely click it open. They'd approved me for $4,000 toward summer housing, which covered about half the cost. It wasn't enough to fully escape, but it meant I could leave 3 months earlier than planned. Georgia screamed so loud when I showed her that customers turned to stare at us. I spent the next week researching student loans and calculating exactly how much debt I'd need to take on. 2 weeks before graduation, I asked my parents to sit down for a family meeting after dinner. I'd practiced my speech 20 times in the mirror